at least once per week for over a decade now. The gold and silver community comes out with articles like this one, as you can see there on your screen, claiming that a gold standard, a global gold standard, is imminent or has been planned since the 1970s by European central banks and European governments. There's just one problem. I'm going to go through that in a little bit. Now, this may have been the plan in the past, however, decades ago. However, what happened, what transpired in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the information I know from Ron Paul, the one-time partial Fed audit, from the Bloomberg News Freedom of Information Act request, and from what I was told by a source that was inside a high-level IMF meeting in March of 2014 about how the European Union, European banks were saved with currency swaps all along the way. Basically from 2008 and 9 at different points, enormous amounts of currency swap, US dollar currency swap liquidity was pulled in, pulled out, just massive amounts. Over 50% of the total amount of currency swaps given out were given out in 2008 and 2009 to European Union governments and European central banks. And yet here we are, another article. And my friend Louis Camarsano at Small Gold, shout out to Louis if he's listening, he can add another one to the list of like gold-backed crypto yuan, petro yuan, gold-backed petro yuan, gold-traded notes. There's a long list of things. The end of the fiat currency system that has been predicted for every month by some experts, and I'm using air quotes, for the last 10, 12 years. So this is just another article to add to the pile. The truth, I have a article there at the bottom that the European Union itself was created in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was pushed by the CIA and by academics, the Ivy League academics here in the US, and by the policymakers here in Washington, D.C. So if you want to read about that, Ambrose Pritchard Evans did an extensive research piece in April 2016 that the European Union was created by the US, by the CIA and other policymakers and academics, and they handpicked their puppet politicians, they went on programs of brainwashing, blah, 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 blah. It's really sad, but this is the central planning that has occurred. They manipulated the media, on and on and on. Okay, so let's talk about this global gold standard. There's a lot of evidence that points to that maybe this was the plan decades ago, and somewhere around the 90s, we got into 2000s. By 2008, this plan was total shit. Okay, so European banks are a mess. Deutsche Bank has been on life support. People keep asking me all the time, when is Deutsche Bank going to collapse? The answer is if the Federal Reserve Bank is going to keep allowing currency swap lines, and the official narrative from the Federal Reserve is that currency swap lines are only temporary, they're very short term, you people, Joes and Janes on Main Street, shouldn't worry about them, they're not a big deal. However, for my Patreon account contributors, I went through the Fed's May 2020 financial stability report, and they had an entire section on currency swaps. And there was lies in the report. However, in the footnotes, I found something that confirmed what I was told by a source that was in an IMF meeting in March of 2014, that Europe was basically getting permanent currency swap lines that the Federal Reserve said did not exist, to keep the European Union together, to help keep the European Union together, to help keep European governments propped up, to help the European Central Bank, and to help European banks, especially Deutsche Bank and their counterparties, deal with derivative problems. So the European Union claiming that the claims in this article, and you should really read the conclusion, that they've been preparing for an international gold standard without the Federal Reserve's help. And the European Union was originally created by the U.S. government, academics here in the U.S. and Ivy League institutions, policymakers here in D.C., and the CIA. It was pushed for decades to organize the European Union. So the evidence points, the actual evidence, what I actually know about 2008 and 9 and the currency swaps does not jive with anything in this article on Voima Gold that Well, his name's not... Koos Jansen was his pen name. He uses Jan Nieuwenhuijs, if that's his real name. I guess that's his real name. His pen name was Koos Jansen. I interviewed him once many years ago. But let's just say I totally disagree with pretty much everything in this article about how they're still pushing for a global gold standard. Now, in the past, that may have been true, decades ago. But once the derivatives market got going and the European banks, like Deutsche Bank, bought Bankers Trust... Once they bought Bankers Trust, they were in a lot of trouble. If you talk to really old Wall Street traders like Dave Kranzler, how lots of people on Wall Street knew that as soon as Deutsche Bank was suckered into buying Bankers Trust, that they were going to be saddled with derivatives problems, that the problem was never going to be fixed. So the amount of physical gold needed... Is there actually any audits on a lot of the G7 European gold? Because the claims in the article is that Europe has plenty of gold. Well, it's the same type of deal with the US. Is there any actual audits of the physical gold? And there's there's evidence that conflicts in the gold community about the physical gold actually being there. Because even King World News has reported for years now, many years. You can go back into King World News's archives, and they've been reporting with their sources that tons of gold coins, gold bars, old European gold that was used as money was sent out of the bank vaults, at the back of the bank vaults of European banks, and it was shipped to Swiss refiners, or it was shipped directly to China. And if it goes to Swiss refiners, it's recast into 4/9 kilobars and then sent to China. And other confirmations of this have also been done about European gold being shipped from European banks. Now, I don't know about European central banks, but definitely European banks. So any gold that European banks could contribute, the private European banks could contribute to a gold standard for Europe, the gold is probably not there. Okay, because not only do you have King World News, their sources reporting on it too, but also Jim Rickards and Alex Stanzik, who help. Alex Stanzik, I think, runs the physical, or he's one of the executives for the Physical Gold Fund, and they do this extensive podcast for years now about the gold market and their contacts. They've interviewed Swiss gold refiners in the past. I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about the gold market, you can listen to their podcast for free. I'll put the Physical Gold Fund podcast, the link to it below this video in the information and description section. And they have been talking about stories for years about how private European banks have been shipping off old gold coins and bars to Swiss refiners. And they even interviewed Swiss gold refiners, at least one of them, I think 2015. It's up there on their YouTube channel on the Physical Gold Fund, where the Swiss gold refiner, the director at one of these large Swiss gold refiners, talks about all the European gold that they're receiving to recast. So here you have my point with all this, and this is just going to be a short podcast. My point with all this is you have an article saying that Europe has plenty of gold for a gold standard, but then here's this other anecdotal evidence from people who have good contacts in the gold industry saying that a lot of the physical gold in Europe, especially the gold at the European banks, it's gone. For a decade now, it's been shipped to Swiss gold refiners to be recast. So the two things do not jive. Do you understand? The two things do not make sense. You can't have, if you're going to write an article saying the European Union has plenty of gold for a gold standard, but then there's also evidence saying, and there is some interesting points that were put in that article. I'm not going to read the article. There's some interesting points in there. However, I think the points are decades old, because I think what really happened in 2008-9 is the European banks got caught playing Wall Street and the US's derivatives game. And then once you're on the currency swap hamster wheel, Europe never in my opinion, the European Union, European banks never really recovered post 2008, 2009. The banks were not recapitalized anywhere near the levels. Deutsche Bank is a zombie being kept alive. Miraculously, the shares haven't crashed, probably because of a bunch of manipulation games. European banks got way more currency swap lines than anyone else. European Union governments and European banks. So this is just another one of these It's an extensively researched piece, but it doesn't jive with anything I've learned about what really happened in 2008 and what I know, what I was told by the currency swaps that were given out. My patrons got a screenshot disclosing permanent currency swap lines out to the European Union. Okay, these are not temporary currency swap lines. Now, the way the currency swap lines work with the central banks is if the European Union needs to borrow $1 trillion, they can borrow $1 trillion tomorrow, and then they could pay it back quickly, or the Fed can waive it. And then this can keep repeating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Where the liquidity is needed, it's the loan, it's like a credit line. It's a line of credit where the credit line is used, it's paid back, or the Fed waives it. It's used again, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And this has been going on for years after 2008. You had the pigs crisis, you had problems in Greece. The European Union, I think, is just a mess. As bad as things are here in the US, the problems with European banks, the problems with the European Union are even worse. And that's one of the reasons why the dollar index is so strong. Because the majority of the dollar index is measured against dollar versus euro. So over 50% of the weighting is dollar versus euro. Super chat from Dimitri. Jason, thank you for your hard work. Even if they manage to go all digital, how long do you think sheeple will tolerate MMT dog poopy money? It would revert to sound money. It depends if we have free speech. It depends if we have free speech, if we're even allowed to talk about it. Dimitri, if we go social credit score, if they make you a criminal to have any protection, any freedom, any protection, you criticize the government and they can shut down your bank accounts or credit cards. Unfortunately, things are going in the opposite direction. Okay, so people are going to bring up, but Jason, all these central banks are accumulating gold. Yes. But these central bankers hate gold. The reason they're accumulating gold is as a hedge. This is why I tell people that they should seriously think about, in my opinion, of being their own central banker. Also being entrepreneurial. Grow your income as an entrepreneur. Also be your own central banker. Central bankers do not like gold. No central bankers like gold. They all hate gold. So why are they buying gold? It's a hedge. They're not buying gold for a gold standard. If you read any of the research reports these central bankers put out, or any of the speeches, they talk about flexibility. You can't have any flexibility on a gold standard. There's none, unless you're going to overstate reserves, gold reserves, or you're going to do a fractional gold standard. So why are they accumulating gold? They're not accumulating gold, in my opinion, for a gold standard. They're accumulating gold for a hedge against the dollar, a hedge against whatever new system. The people in power are testing government cryptocurrencies. They're using politically correct culture to eliminate our free speech. They're talking about social credit scores in the West now. Dimitri says he lived in the USSR. Speech always frees itself. So do the people. Trust me. I hope you're right. Eventually, yes. Unfortunately, things are going in the opposite direction still. I hope you're right. Super chat from Larkval. Thank you for the super chat. I love your article on Campbell Soup. You're welcome. That company benefited heavily from people hoarding and stockpiling. So it was a really bad company going into the global pandemic. They had a lot of problems. I haven't looked in a couple months at their balance sheet, though. RR says Jim Rickards writes about they always planned to go back to a gold standard, but so many countries had left it, they just never went back. I disagree with that. You can't have hundreds of trillions of dollars in derivatives and a gold standard. You can't. It just doesn't jive. The only way to pretend for the banks to be solvent, for the governments to be solvent, is to just paper things over. You can't do that on a gold standard. Once they went to the derivatives market with hundreds of trillions, if not more than that, I don't know if we're ever going to get like honest, accurate transparency with audits for the amount of derivatives. All we have for the amount of derivatives is what the Bank of International Settlements and a few other agencies report every couple months. When you have hundreds of trillions of dollars in derivatives, and all it takes is one or two large banks or one or two large hedge funds to cause a chain reaction of counterparty failure, banks failing. Why do you think Deutsche Bank has been propped up so long? You can't do that on a gold standard. And the derivatives markets are used to manipulate interest rates and commodity prices. So maybe Europe did have a plan in the 70s and 80s, because Charles de Gaulle did take his physical gold, did send a destroyer over to take the physical gold back. Richard Nixon got pissed. President Richard Nixon got pissed. However, it is very clear that the European banks got involved with the Wall Street banks and started playing the crazy derivatives games. And then once that happened, there's no way you can go back on a gold standard. Not for a while anyway. You have to agree. Everyone has to agree on a new system. Plus, I think I've laid out that the European Union, European banks, are dependent on currency swaps. They never, in my opinion, they never really recovered after 2008 and 2009. They have a permanent credit facility of currency swaps. There's only 5 other governments that have that. The permanent credit facility has been in place for years now. Okay, no one's supposed to have a permanent credit facility. You know what? Also, the press releases with the currency swaps that came out, I think, in February and March, you know what that means? That means there's multiple currency swap lines out. If the Fed had to put press releases for multiple currency swap lines out for the European Union and others, that means there's more than one currency swap line outstanding for the European Union. That means they have multiple currency swap lines of credit, which the Fed can then, if they want, because it's subjective and arbitrary, the Fed can waive them to keep the system, the status quo maintained, to keep this zombie slugging along. And again, the other thing here is, do these G7 countries, so Italy, Germany might have their gold. Someone put in the comment section, Germany might have their gold. Do these other G7 countries, will they agree to audits? Do you think Italy has all their gold? Italy is involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy has been making nice with the Chinese Communist Party. What do you think the Chinese Communist Party wanted as collateral for some of those loans and investments for the Belt and Road Initiative? Italy was the first G7 country, I believe, to join the Belt and Road Initiative for China. What do you think China asked for from Italy? Maybe China asked for their gold? We wouldn't know. This is my point. We need an audit. But none of these governments want to do audits. So everyone screams at like, oh, the US won't agree to a gold audit and the audits, the gold's not there. Well, the gold might not be there for the European countries either. The gold is probably there for Germany. I'm very skeptical about the gold being there for the other countries. France and other European G7 countries have been too nice to the Chinese Communist Party for a long time. So I wouldn't be surprised if China has a lot of European gold, because the anecdotal evidence from King World News on their gold contacts for years now, Alex Stanzig from the Physical Gold podcast, Jim Rickards talking about massive amounts. I think even Alistair McLeod talked about this too, his London gold contacts. Tons and tons of private European bank gold that was old coins and bars, old money from the past, from past gold standards, was shipped to Swiss refiners or directly to China and then recast into 4/9 kilo bars. And if they don't have that much gold, how are they going to have a gold standard? It just doesn't make any sense. So the assumption in the article here is that these G7 European countries, other than Germany, all still have their gold. And I'm saying that really, based on what I've learned about the gold market and these other experts that are talking about the amount of gold that has left Europe from banks and elsewhere to Swiss refiners and then to China, the odds are these European governments have probably participated in that. Aggregator says China has claims on European gold. We don't know that. We don't know what terms China demanded for the Belt Road Initiative and other loans. We don't know. Just because China issued a press release saying what the terms might be publicly, that's probably not the real terms. Randy asks, if no one has the gold, who does have it? Probably the Chinese government, probably private citizens in China, because that's the gold was old gold. It probably wasn't as pure, and it was probably sent to Swiss refiners to be recast, and then it was sent to China. And I don't think the Chinese want a gold standard either. Not with the credit bubble they have. Yeah, but Russia's not part of the European Union or the G7. Yeah, Alistair is calling for end of the fiat currency system. But if you look at the press releases, all these governments are moving along with progress government cryptocurrency. So I don't know if you want to call that fiat currency or government token. Ludwig von Mises would have called it a token, which is even just as bad, if not worse. So the whole point here is that there is no transparency with any of these governments. People complain about the US not having transparency. Well, these European governments don't have transparency either. With their European banks or their gold holdings, they don't do audits either. So we can't assume that they have, other than maybe Germany, we can't assume that any of these other European countries have any physical gold for a gold standard. And European banks are a mess. European banks have been on life support, especially Deutsche Bank, and now HSBC Bank in my opinion. But European banks have been a mess for over a decade. None of the problems at the European banks was fixed. They're still a mess. You can go back on other channels like Real Vision TV and others with experts talking about European banking problems for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's just getting worse. And no one wants to touch European bank stocks. And yet Deutsche Bank is not at zero. Probably because one of the major reasons Deutsche Bank's probably not at zero, because of the currency swap lines. The currency swap lines help prevent derivatives from collapsing everything. Okay, well, I think that's the end of my rant for today. So, it's a very extensive piece. I'll put it below the information and description section. There's no proof a lot of these other G7 countries have physical gold. If you speak to a lot of people in the gold industry, they'll tell you that lots and lots of gold has been leaving private European bank vaults for years, over a decade. The Swiss gold refiners were running at insane capacity before the pandemic to recast those bars into 4/9 kilobars. That's the evidence that I've heard. And again, if you're going to play in the derivatives markets with many trillions of dollars, you can't have a gold standard. You're just going to piss off the US. And the Federal Reserve has the currency swap lines. If the Fed pulled the currency swap lines now to the European Union and the European banks, what do you think would happen? So to say Europe's close to going to a gold standard and the fiat currency is going to end soon and Europe's going to have a global international gold standard, what do you think would happen then if the US and the Federal Reserve, US government and the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury decided, okay, Europe, we're going to pull those currency swap lines, all your banks, bye-bye. You don't think some of those European banks would be in big trouble in the next month or two? I think they would be. I think it's clear that those currency swap lines are what's keeping the European banks alive. And it's the evidence I've gotten, and I've talked about this in articles for my Patreon account contributors. There's a lot of evidence that those currency swap lines never fully went away after 2008 and 9. The Fed temporarily took some away, and by 2011, 12, 13, 14, there was big problems in the European Union again with the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Problems in Greece, derivatives connected to that. Italy and Greece should have never been in the European Union. There was derivatives tied to that. So right now, the European Union, the politicians, the puppets, the media that the CIA and the US government have installed in the European Union, a lot of them anyway. Obviously, some elections are going to change that, but in general, for decades now, that has been policy here in the US. They're not going to go against the US on a lot of different things, especially when all the US has to do is just say, we're pulling the currency swap lines. You're on your own. We're protecting our banks. Your banks are done. I don't trust any government at this point, and obviously some governments are way worse than others. You can't trust any government at this point. You need to be your own central banker. You need to rely on yourself. If you rely on any one expert, you're going to be in trouble. Because if they make mistakes, big mistakes, you could lose a lot of money. Be your own central banker and be entrepreneurial. Those are your best shots here going forward. I think things are going to get worse before they get better. I do not see a gold standard in the near future. I think these governments want to eliminate freedom of speech, get more control. These politicians are getting way too happy with more control over things. These local and state politicians here in the US. And don't be surprised. RR says all these governments are corrupt. Yeah, I fully agree. And do not be surprised if they try to implement big technology. They're already doing this. They're censoring people. They're ruining people's YouTube channels. They're ruining people financially. I added on my new George Gammon interview, it has almost 50,000 views from a week ago, a little over a week ago. And I added maybe a couple hundred new subscribers to my channel. That's it. Don't be surprised if the social credit score, a draconian version, comes here to the US and the West. Which would make even less freedom, and then people speaking out would be risking getting financially ruined. I mean, to a certain extent, we already have that. If you're making money online using YouTube or other social media platforms, they can deplatform you and then you're done. So plan accordingly. If you're your own central banker and you have dollars and gold and silver and you have it stored in multiple places, if you can afford to do so, and you have some stored on you with some lead bullion in a safe, and then maybe you have a little bit, tiny amount of cryptocurrency, maybe a little bit of Bitcoin or something, I wouldn't put a lot into it because Jim Rogers has been warning people that governments are going to ban it. The rules are going to change a lot. They've already changed a lot in the last 5 months. Okay, everyone, thanks for listening. End of rant.